The last breath of autumn swept across the Colorado highlands like a warning. Wind slid down the cliffs in sharp, icy ribbons, stirring up spirals of brittle leaves that skittered across the hard-packed earth. The world felt pared down to bone, raw, wind-blasted, waiting for winter to claim it. On mornings like this, even sound seemed muted, swallowed by the endless sweep of Devil's Ridge. Nita Vance moved through the timberline with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged to the land far more than she ever belonged to people. 32 years old, slight but sinewed, she carried herself with the calm, watchful confidence her Apache mother had taught her. Measured, grounded, unyielding. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. She had grown up between worlds, and the wind was far kinder than most men had ever been. Her small hunting cabin sat low on the southern slope, half hidden by ponderosa pines twisted from decades of storms. It was not much, just a slanted roof and a single-room interior, but it was hers. Hers in a way nothing linked to the Vance name had ever been. That name, even now, it tasted like rust. The Vance family had been landowners for generations, respected, wealthy, influential in the nearest town. But respect never softened prejudice, and influence only sharpened cruelty. When the family patriarch died and the will was opened, Nita learned exactly what her bloodline meant to them. "Half-breed," she heard whispered behind closed doors. "Not one of us." When she challenged their lies and the forged documents they pushed forward, they cast her out without hesitation. No land, no inheritance, no place at their table, only the remnants of her mother's teachings and the fierce instinct to survive. So she stayed on the ridge, hunting elk and mule deer, repairing her cabin on her own, living in the only place that didn't demand she apologize for existing. That morning she followed fresh tracks, buck prints pressed deep into thin frost, and felt herself slip into the steady rhythm of the hunt. But when the tracks veered toward an older trail near the northern end of the ridge, a trail she never used, a faint tug of memory pulled at her. Her mother's voice, soft, tired, threaded with regret. "If you ever come across the old cabin, Nita, listen to your heart." She never understood what it meant, until now. The brush thinned suddenly, revealing a clearing she didn't know existed. And at its center stood a small cabin, old, weather-worn, its logs faded to silver. The roof sagged slightly on one side, but someone had reinforced it recently. The porch steps were new, the windows patched, the chimney swept clean. A faint dusting of ash clung to the stones beneath the flue, as if a fire had burned there not too long ago. Her breath slowed. This place should have been abandoned decades ago, but someone had cared for it. She pushed open the door. It creaked softly but didn't resist, another sign of upkeep. The inside smelled of dust, old pine resin, and something familiar she couldn't name. A single trunk sat near the far wall, its lid half ajar as if waiting for her. She knelt and lifted it. Inside lay a few objects wrapped in faded fabric, a tin cup, a baby's quilt, loose pages tied with old string. And at the bottom, wrapped in a square of worn, hand-woven cloth, she found a Bible. It was old, spine cracked, pages yellowed, but what stole her breath was the cloth around it. Beaded edges, dyed in earth tones, marked with the unmistakable Apache symbol her mother used whenever something mattered deeply. Nita traced the beadwork with trembling fingers. Her mother had touched this, protected it, hidden it. Why? She opened the Bible. There on the inside cover was her mother's handwriting, delicate, looping, unmistakable. For the child who must one day know. A jolt went through her chest. Fear, longing, confusion, all tangled. Something had been buried here, intentionally, painfully. Something her mother never dared speak aloud. And the Vance family, God, they must have known. They must have fought to keep this place secret, whatever it held. She rose to her feet, the Bible clutched to her chest. The wind outside had changed, no longer restless, now alert, watchful. She heard it then, a sound too deliberate to be chance. A single footstep outside the cabin door, soft, slow, human. Not a deer, not a cougar, not the wind. Nita turned her head toward the sound, heart pounding once, hard, certain. Someone else had come to Devil's Ridge. Someone who had been here before her. Someone who might not want her uncovering what this cabin meant. and they were standing just outside. The knife was already in Nita's hand before she fully turned. Instinct came first, sharp, automatic, drilled into her by years of living alone on the ridge. She held the blade low, angled, steady, the way her mother once taught her when danger came quietly instead of roaring. But the figure standing in the doorway wasn't a trespasser with a rifle or a bounty hunter with a grudge. It was a woman. A middle-aged woman wrapped in a wool coat dusted with frost, her shoulders stiff from the climb, her breath rising in thin puffs in the bone-cold air. She looked weary, wind-bitten, and deeply out of place among the pines and the raw silence of Devil's Ridge. Her eyes, earnest, anxious, searching, landed on the knife first, then on Nita. "I'm not here to hurt you," the woman said, voice tight but not trembling. Nita didn't lower the blade. Strangers didn't simply wander onto this slope, and certainly not in late autumn when the cold could strip a person to the bone. "Who are you?" Nita asked, her voice flat, guarded. The woman swallowed once, as if preparing herself for something heavier than the cold. "My name is Grace Henley," she said. "I came because this cabin is connected to our mother." The words hit the air like a gunshot. Nita froze, not out of fear but out of disbelief so sharp it sliced through her anger. The woman must be mistaken, lying, confused. "Our," Nita echoed, her tone turning razor thin. "You've got the wrong cabin." Grace took a small step inside, palms visible, the way someone might approach a skittish horse. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." Nita's jaw clenched. She felt the walls closing in, the weight of old memories pressing at her ribcage. "Turn around," she said, "and walk back the way you came." Most people would have left. Anyone with sense would retreat into the safety of the trail. But Grace didn't move. Instead, she reached into the inside pocket of her coat. Slowly, deliberately. Nita tensed, knuckles whitening around the knife handle. But Grace only pulled out a photograph, worn, sepia-toned, its edges curled like dried leaves. She held it out. Nita didn't want to look, but something about the woman's expression, solemn, aching, resolute, made her reach for it anyway. The breath left her lungs. It was her mother, decades younger, but unmistakable. The shape of her eyes, the slope of her cheekbones. She was cradling a newborn wrapped in a narrow woven blanket, and there, dangling from her ears, were the turquoise earrings Nita had kept in a cedar box since the day her mother died. Her mother never took them off, not once in Nita's memory. Nita's hand trembled despite herself. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Grace's voice cracked. "She gave it to the woman who ran the Denver orphanage, the woman who raised me. I've had it all my life." The words didn't make sense, they couldn't. But the photograph felt real, raw, honest, undeniable, in a way lies never did. "You're saying she was your mother too?" Nita asked, though she hated how unsteady the question sounded. Grace nodded, eyes glistening. "I was taken from her, right after birth. She never had a chance to fight for me. And from what I've learned, your family made sure of that." A spark of fury ignited behind Nita's ribs. Hot, wild, immediate. Her voice dropped low. "Don't talk about the Vance family like you know what happened." "I don't know everything," Grace said softly, "but I know enough to believe we're blood." She hesitated, looking at the old cabin as if it held answers she'd chased for half her life. "I came here because this place is the beginning, and because I need to know the truth." Nita stepped back, shaking her head, the cold biting at her throat. "You need to leave, now!" The wind outside howled, piling snow against the porch in restless drifts. The air inside the cabin grew tight, almost suffocating. The two women stared at each other, one defensive, the other determined, neither willing to break first. Grace exhaled long and slow, as if accepting she wouldn't win today. She reached into her satchel and placed a stack of old papers on the table, weathered pages tied loosely with twine. "I'm not asking you to believe me," she said. "Not yet, but I'm coming back." She paused. Those belonged to her. Before Nita could speak, Grace stepped out into the wind, disappearing into the swirling white like a ghost returning to the ridge. Nita stood motionless for several breaths before finally turning to the papers. Her fingers hesitated. Then she untied the string. On the very top was a letter, ink faded, handwriting familiar enough to steal the strength from her knees. "If you have found this cabin, it means the truth is ready to return to the light." Nita stared at the words, the wind moaning through the eaves as if the ridge itself had been waiting for this moment. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she was ready. The cabin felt smaller after Grace left, quieter, heavier, as if the very logs were holding their breath. Snow drifted against the window panes, whispering against the glass in restless strokes. Nita sat alone at the narrow table, the stack of weathered letters spread before her like a trail of old ghosts. She lit a lantern, its flame trembling against the draft slipping through the chinks in the walls. The warm glow softened nothing. It only sharpened the ache in her chest. Her hands, usually steady and sure, shook as she untied the brittle string holding the letters together. The first page smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Her mother's handwriting curled across it, soft, looping, almost shy. A script Nita knew by heart. She read until the world outside faded. Her mother had been young, too young, when she met Thomas Henley, a ranch hand passing through the high country. He was kind then, gentle, with a quiet way of speaking and a fondness for the mountains. Her mother wrote about him the way some women write about sunlight. Something rare, something fleeting, something they didn't believe they deserved. And then came the child her mother called My Little Dawn, Grace. Born right here in this cabin, on a storm-lashed night when the wind screamed down Devil's Ridge like it wanted to tear the world open. Her mother wrote about holding the newborn against her chest, feeling warmth bloom in a life that had always felt too cold. Nita paused, the ink swimming slightly as her eyes burned. She had never imagined her mother as anything but tired, burdened, carrying unspoken regrets. Yet here, in these pages, was a woman fierce and hopeful. A woman who once believed she could carve out a place in the harsh frontier. But the next letters darkened. Her mother wrote about the Vance family, about the moment they learned of Grace's birth. Marcus Vance, even then arrogant and sharp-tongued, had stormed into her mother's life with threats wrapped in polite smiles. The Vances would not allow a Henley child, let alone a child born of a native woman, to be tied to their name. They took the baby, just like that. Her mother had begged, fought, cried until her throat tore raw. It didn't matter. The Vances carried Grace away before her mother had even healed from childbirth. She wrote that she felt cut in half, robbed not only of her child, but of her right to speak of her. The Vances warned her. Mention the child again, and she would lose everything. Her home, her safety, her place in their world. Nita ground her teeth, jaw tight with fury. She had known the Vances were proud, cold, unyielding. But this was cruelty carved deep into the bone. In later letters, her mother explained that she had married Nita's father, a quiet, hard-working miner who treated her with respect because she needed stability after losing her first child. She wrote that she loved him in a different way, a steadier way, but that a part of her heart never healed. Nita felt her chest split open with grief and anger, so that was why her mother avoided town. Why she never let the Vance name touch her home. Why she kept those turquoise earrings close, as if clinging to the last thing she still had of Grace. The letters were a confession, a wound, a plea. And suddenly everything Nita had ever felt, the rejection, the sideways glances, the way the Vances dismissed her as half-breed trouble, it all snapped into place. They hadn't just despised her bloodline, they had destroyed her mother's life long before Nita was even born. She rose from the table, pacing the narrow cabin, the lantern flame flickering across her sharp features. Fury simmered low, slow, bone deep. For years she had believed the Vances hated her for her own sake, for her mixed blood, her stubbornness, her refusal to bow. But this hatred, this betrayal, it was older than she was. Her mother's anguish had been her inheritance. Outside, the wind shifted, howling through the trees like a wounded thing. The cabin groaned, as if echoing every buried secret that had lived in its walls for 60 long years. Nita pressed her palms to the table, steadying herself. Decision came to her like a strike of lightning. Clean, sharp, undeniable. She would not let the Vances bury another truth. Not this time. Not when the past had finally clawed its way to the surface. A crunch of footsteps broke the storm's rhythm. Nita turned, knife instinctively in her hand again. But the figure in the doorway was no enemy. Grace stood there, cheeks windburned, breath ragged from the climb. And in her gloved hand she held something wrapped in oilcloth. "A will," Grace said, voice trembling. "The real one. Uncle Jeremiah left everything to the two daughters of the Apache woman. The final ember of doubt inside Nita died. The war with the Vance family had officially begun. Morning came gray and sluggish, dragging a low fog across Devil's Ridge like a shroud. The cabin felt colder than it had the night before, as if the truth uncovered from those old letters had seeped into the walls and settled there, chilling the air from the inside out. Nita sat hunched near the table, the lantern still burning though dawn had arrived, its flames shrinking against the draft that wriggled through the chinks. Grace stood across from her, arms crossed, shoulders stiff beneath her wool coat. Her face carried that tired, storm-beaten look of someone who hadn't slept in weeks, maybe years. Between them lay the open will, Jeremiah Vance's real handwriting, ragged along the edges, stained with age. To the daughters of the Apache woman, daughters plural. No room for doubt now. Nita felt something shift inside her, a mixture of vindication and dread, thick as mud. "We need to piece this together," Grace said, pushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Everything we know, everything they tried to bury." Nita nodded, though her throat felt tight. She pushed the letters toward Grace, and together they formed a grim mosaic of betrayal. Pages of confession, court documents, hospital records Grace had dug up, and the will that Marcus had hidden for decades. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened, cruel and unmistakable. Marcus Vance wasn't just cruel, he was calculating, cold-blooded, and he had been tightening his grip on the Vance legacy for years. "He forged the new will," Grace said quietly. "Replaced Jeremiah's original with one that favors him entirely. Claimed the old man changed his mind on his deathbed. But he didn't," Nita muttered. "Jeremiah meant for us to inherit, both of us." Grace nodded, and Marcus made sure no one ever found out. They sifted through more evidence. Grace laid out court notices and adoption records, files stamped with Marcus's signature. He had filed the paperwork that erased Grace's existence from the Vance family tree. He'd rewritten the story in legal ink, positioning himself as sole heir, the only one fit to continue the Vance name. And then came the newest pieces. Medical documents Grace had stolen from the law office where Marcus worked. Papers that made Nita's stomach knot. "He denied your claim to the family land by insisting you're not a real Vance," Grace said, voice low. "But at the same time," she tapped the medical files, "he's been telling a pharmaceutical company that you're a direct blood descendant." Nita stared at her. "Why?" Grace swallowed hard. "Because of Huntington's." A hollow quiet filled the small cabin. Even the wind outside paused, as if listening. Huntington's disease, the slow thief, the Vance legacy no one dared speak aloud. Nita knew the stories. Jeremiah's brother losing his mind, a cousin dying young, an uncle who shook uncontrollably by the end. She had always hoped the stories would skip her, that her mother's Apache blood would save her somehow. But her hands had been trembling lately, and last week she'd forgotten the name of a plant she had known since childhood. "I don't need a doctor to tell me what this is," Nita murmured. Grace's eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. "Marcus made you vulnerable on purpose. He thought people wouldn't question him if he framed you as unstable. And once you were isolated enough, he'd sell my body to a lab," Nita finished, her tone flat, brittle. "Use my blood as proof I'm his sister when it's convenient. Deny me as family when it's not." Grace looked pained. "Yes." Nita rose abruptly, pacing the narrow length of the cabin. Rage tightened across her shoulders like a rawhide cinch. Her whole life she'd been treated as an outsider, as if her mother's blood made her lesser. But to learn now that Marcus had been pulling the strings all along, shaping every hardship she faced, every rejection, every whisper behind her back, it cut deeper than she expected. "They destroyed her," Nita said, voice cracking. "My mother. They tore her child away and then used her grief to keep her silent. And now they want to do the same thing to me." Grace didn't speak. She didn't need to. The truth hung between them, heavy, brutal, undeniable. Nita stopped pacing, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. Her hands trembled again, not from disease this time, but from fury so fierce it nearly swallowed her whole. "I won't let them," she whispered. "Not again. Not to me. Not to you." Grace stepped closer, her expression solemn. "There's more," she said softly. Nita looked up, jaw tight. Grace exhaled a slow, trembling breath before speaking the four words that turned Nita's blood cold. "He's collecting you, Nita." By midday, the sky over Devil's Ridge had turned the color of tarnished steel. Clouds rolled low and heavy, dragging long shadows across the mountainside. The wind snapped through the pines in hard-edged, restless gusts, warning of a storm climbing up the slope. Nita stepped outside to gather kindling when she spotted a rider making his way toward the cabin. A lone horseman, shoulders hunched against the cold, badge glinting faintly on his coat. Sheriff Morrison. His presence struck her with equal parts relief and irritation. The law rarely climbed this high unless trouble trailed close behind. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching on the frost-bitten ground. "Nita," he called, voice steady but wary. "Need a word with you." She didn't bother hiding her distrust. "What now?" He sighed, brushing snow from his mustache. "Marcus Vance came to the office this morning. Filed a complaint." Nita folded her arms. "Of course he did. Says you broke into Vance property, damaged a structure, took items that didn't belong to you." Nita let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "This cabin belonged to my mother long before any Vance set foot on this ridge. Marcus doesn't own it." "Maybe not," Morrison said gently, "but you don't have papers proving that either." The truth stung. Her mother had never trusted the legal system enough to leave a trail of ownership. And in this town, the Vance documents always weighed heavier than Apache memories. Nita stepped closer, jaw tight. "You really think I'd break into a place that has my mother's symbol carved on the rafters?" Morrison met her glare. His weathered face softened for a heartbeat, an unspoken apology hiding behind his eyes. "I don't think you're lying," he said quietly, "but I can't accuse Marcus without proof." Of course, always proof. And Marcus had spent his whole life rewriting what counted as truth. Before Nita could answer, Grace stepped out of the cabin, pulling her coat tighter around her. She nodded politely at the sheriff but kept her distance. Morrison tipped his hat. "Ma'am," Grace's voice was cool. "Marcus has reason to keep this cabin off the record." Nita shot her a quick warning look, but Grace pressed on. "This place holds more history than he wants anyone to know." The sheriff shifted uneasily. He knew the Vance family well. Too well. Their influence stretched from the courthouse steps to the bank's front door. But something in his expression said he'd begun to see the cracks forming beneath their polished reputation. "I'll look into it," Morrison finally said. Quietly, he swung back into the saddle. "Just don't go picking fights, Nita. I'd hate to see you shoved into something ugly." "Ugly already found me," she muttered. He gave her a long, assessing look before riding off, the horse disappearing into the bleak haze gathering over the ridge. Silence settled again, but not the peaceful kind, the bone-cold, watchful kind. Grace moved closer. "He's trying to help." "Help doesn't stop Marcus," Nita said. "Nothing ever did." She stepped around the cabin, scanning the ground out of habit. That's when she saw them. Fresh footprints circling the structure. Not Morrison's, not Grace's. Someone had been here. Recently. The prints were deliberate, slow, a message spelled out in snow. Grace knelt beside her, breath hitching. "He's already watching us. Or sending someone too." Nita's hand drifted instinctively to the knife she kept tucked in her boot. "He wants me rattled." But she wasn't rattled, she was angry. Storm clouds deepened overhead, dark as gunmetal. The wind shrieked through the trees, carrying the sharp scent of coming snow. That night, the storm hit hard. Wind battered the cabin walls, rattling the shutters. Snow blew under the door in thin, icy streaks. Every few minutes, the wood creaked as if something or someone leaned against it. Nita stayed awake, listening to every sound. But it was Grace who finally gripped her wrist and whispered, voice shaking not with fear, but certainty. "Marcus doesn't just want the land," she said. "He needs your blood. He needs proof you're part of the Vance line for that pharmaceutical deal." Nita stared at her, heart slamming against her ribs. "He can't have it." Grace nodded fiercely. "Then we fight." Outside, wind howled like a wounded animal. Inside, a different kind of storm gathered. Sharp-eyed, relentless, ready to bare its teeth. For the first time, the two sisters stood fully united, the weight of 60 years of secrets pressing them into the same corner. And corners were dangerous places in the West, because the only way out was to strike back. The two sisters made their decision. They would fight. The storm on Devil's Ridge broke sometime before dawn, leaving behind a frozen stillness that felt almost unnatural, as if the world were catching its breath after a night of rage. Snow clung to the cabin roof in thick drifts, and a brittle crust of ice glazed the pines. Inside, the lantern was still burning low, casting warm gold over two women who had finally stopped running from the truth. Grace leaned over the table, sleeves rolled, eyes sharp with that legal, sharp-minded precision she'd honed over years of digging into other people's secrets. Across from her, Nita sat with her elbows braced on her knees, half Apache spirit and half frontier grit, the kind of woman the West forged from pain and stubborn hope. "We can't just react anymore," Grace said, tapping a stack of documents. "Marcus has the advantage. Money, reputation, the courts. We have to make him expose himself." Nita smirked lightly. "Arrogance is one thing the Vance men never lack, and that's exactly what we'll use." Grace began laying out their strategy with the confidence of someone who had spent her life studying the weaknesses of powerful men. His ego is his soft spot. He thinks he's untouchable. If he believes you're scared, sick, desperate, he'll loosen his guard. Nita lifted a brow. "You want me to act weaker than I am?" "Not weaker," Grace corrected. "Just more fragile. Enough for him to think you're losing control." That word, fragile, made something tight in Nita's chest. She wasn't used to pretending weakness. Her whole life had been a fight to stand her ground, to prove she wasn't the half-breed girl who didn't belong anywhere. But if pretending weakness for a moment gave her a chance to take back everything stolen from her mother and from Grace, she would do worse. Nita nodded slowly. "Fine, what's my part?" "You let the town believe your symptoms are getting worse," Grace said gently. "Shaky hands, forgetful moments, maybe even a stumble or two when folks are watching." "And you?" Nita asked. "I'll make sure the right ears hear the right rumors." Grace's expression hardened into something cool and strategic, far different from the woman who'd cried over their mother's stolen past just hours earlier. "Word will spread fast in a place like this, especially if it sounds like you're willing to negotiate your share of the inheritance in exchange for treatment." Nita barked a short, bitter laugh. "He's always been predictable. Dangle something he wants, and he'll come running." "He won't just come running," Grace said. "He'll try to take control of the situation, and that's when we make him talk. Make him confess. Let his own pride bury him." They worked through every detail: who to speak with, which allies could be trusted, how to make the rumors convincing without turning Nita into a victim. Grace's legal training blended with Nita's frontier instincts, forming a plan built from equal parts intellect and grit. Outside, snow slid from the cabin roof with a long, heavy thud. Inside, something else settled between them. The beginning of trust. At one point, Grace paused, her voice softer than Nita had ever heard it. "I used to wonder why I felt so misplaced, like something in me knew I'd been ripped away from where I belonged." Nita looked at her carefully. Grace's eyes shimmered. Not weak, just honest. "I think she missed you," Nita said quietly. "Our mother. I think she carried that wound her whole life." Grace swallowed hard. "I'm sorry you were left to carry the rest." Nita shook her head. "We both carry it now, and that makes it lighter." For the first time since they'd met, Grace smiled. A real one, not the guarded, hard-bitten kind she wore like armor. Afternoon came, gray and wind-scarred, and just as they predicted, the rumor spread with the speed of prairie fire. Milt at the supply shop whispered to the doctor. The doctor whispered to the banker. By sundown, half the town had heard that Nita Vance, Marcus's troublesome Apache-seeming cousin, was considering a private agreement. They didn't have to wait long. Just after dusk, a rider appeared on the narrow trail leading toward the cabin. Not Sheriff Morrison, not a stranger. A familiar gait, a familiar arrogance in the way the horse was pushed too hard. A messenger handed Grace a folded note sealed with the Vance family crest. Grace opened it, her breath tightened. Nita stepped behind her. "What does it say?" Grace looked up, eyes grave. "He agreed," she whispered. "Marcus wants a private meeting." She hesitated, then added the part that made Nita's pulse thrum with cold, raw instinct. "He says he'll only talk if you come alone." The wind cut sharp along Main Street as Nita made her way toward Marcus Vance's office. Part courthouse, part personal throne, all carved from the arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him more than he could spend. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves, forming puddles that reflected the dust-choked storefronts and the curious stares of townsfolk who whispered as she passed. She kept her shoulders rounded, her steps unsteady. Every movement carefully crafted to look fragile, trembly, unsettled, the opposite of who she was. This was the role she'd chosen, the role she needed him to believe. Marcus's building sat at the far end of the street, marked by a polished brass plaque and an oversized set of windows meant to intimidate. She paused, drew a slow breath, let her hands shake, just enough, and pushed the door open. Inside, the office smelled of ink, whiskey, and expensive wool. Marcus stood behind his desk, dressed in a tailored coat that didn't match the rugged world outside. He wasn't a man shaped by the land or the wind. He was shaped by greed. And he smiled when he saw her. "Well, well," he drawled, stepping forward with a look that tried to mimic concern but came off slick-tongued and mean-eyed. "Little Nita Vance, you look unwell." She lowered her gaze, playing the part. Marcus, I needed to talk about everything." "Of course you did." His tone dripped with superiority. "You've realized your situation, realized what you're worth." He circled her like a trader examining a horse at auction. "You carry something rare," he murmured. "Something science can use. Something I can use." Nita swallowed hard, letting her breathing hitch just enough for him to feel triumphant. "I'm tired," she whispered. "Sick. I can't fight anymore." Marcus's grin widened, smug and hungry. "Good. You shouldn't fight. You were never built for it." The words cut like a blade, but Nita kept her expression wilted, small. He guided her to a chair. "Tell me what you want." Her voice wavered. "I just want to talk about the land, about Grace, about the inheritance. Maybe we can make a deal." Marcus leaned back, hands clasped over his stomach, arrogance radiating off him like heat from a forge. "A deal," he said slowly. "Finally, you're speaking sense." He poured himself a glass of whiskey. "Your mother always taught you to dig your heels in. That Apache stubbornness. Shame. It never did either of you any good." Nita's jaw twitched. She forced her hands to tremble instead of clench. He went on, enjoying every word. "She was an ugly woman," he said casually. "Dirty, savage. Jeremiah disgraced the Vance name the moment he laid eyes on her." Nita looked down so he wouldn't see the fury sparking behind her eyes. "She should have been grateful we let her stay on the outskirts at all," Marcus continued. "Half-blood children, both of you. You were a stain before you even took your first breath." Nita's breath hitched, but she made it a frightened sound, not an angry one. "Marcus," she whispered, "please, that will. Grace found something. Something you hid." He froze for a fraction of a second, then recovered, expression turning sly. "Your sister is naive," he said. "She doesn't know how the world works." Nita kept her voice quivering. "She said the old will might say that she and you inherit?" Marcus snorted. "Ridiculous." He stepped closer, too close. "The real will is the one I submitted 20 years ago? And even if there were another one," his smile sharpened, "it wouldn't matter." Nita let her lower lip tremble. Why wouldn't it matter?" Marcus chuckled, a low, hollow-souled sound. "Because if there ever was a true will..." He leaned in, breath hot with whiskey. "I burned it myself." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Nita kept perfectly still, terrified, shaken, exactly what he expected. Inside, though? Inside, she felt something cold and deadly click into place. He had finally said the one thing they needed. He had confessed, out loud, with pride, as if destruction were his birthright. He stepped back, satisfied with his own brilliance. "Your mother never had any claim. You don't either." Nita let out a trembling breath. I understand." She rose slowly, keeping her shoulders sagged, her body fragile. "Good girl," Marcus murmured. But as she reached for the door, the fear in her face melted for just a heartbeat, replaced by something sharp, icy, precise. A look he didn't see, because he was too busy admiring himself. Outside, the wind howled down Main Street as if warning the town that something had shifted. Something irreversible. "Hookway fan." Marcus Vance leaned back in his chair, smug and oblivious, repeating the words that sealed his fate. "The real will? I burned it years ago." For a moment after Marcus's confession, the room went still. So still Nita could hear her own pulse beating in her ears. Marcus stood there smug and loose-shouldered, as if burning a man's last will was nothing more than flicking ash from a cigar. But he didn't know the storm already waiting behind him. The office door burst open, hard enough to rattle the glass panes. Marcus spun around, irritation rising like heat off sun-baked rocks. Sheriff Morrison stepped in first, jaw set, eyes clouded with stern, dust-worn disappointment. Behind him came Deputy Collins, the district prosecutor from Trinidad, and Grace. Shoulders squared, chin high, face pale with the adrenaline of holding in the truth until the perfect moment. Marcus's expression soured instantly. "What is this?" Sheriff Morrison's voice was flat. A mistake, Marcus. A big one. Nita rose slowly from her chair. The trembling she had faked earlier vanished. Now she stood solid, spine straight, her expression iron-backed and calm. Marcus blinked between them, confusion and anger tangling across his face. Sheriff, this is a private meeting. No, Morrison said, it isn't. Grace stepped forward and placed a small silver recorder on Marcus's expensive oak desk. It was still blinking. Red. Still recording. Every word, she said softly. Everything you just bragged about. Marcus's face drained of color, then flushed into a blotchy, furious red. You? He snarled at Nita, pointing a shaking finger. You set me up. She didn't flinch. You set yourself up. The prosecutor unfolded a warrant with slow, deliberate precision, the legal equivalent of cocking a rifle. We've been building this case for weeks. Today you gave us the rest. Marcus's voice turned wild, sharp-edged. This is illegal. She tricked me. Grace's tone was calm, steady, devastating. You tricked an entire family, stole a child, burned a will, lied under oath, and apparently thought you were too clever to ever be caught. Marcus's eyes darted between them, desperate for control. You think anyone will believe the word of a... He stopped himself too late. Sheriff Morrison finished it quietly, voice heavy with disgust. Go on, Marcus. Say it. Marcus spat it anyway. A half-breed. That's what she is. That's what her mother was. And that bloodline has been a curse on this family since the moment it crawled in. Grace stiffened. But Nita only straightened taller. She stepped closer, calm, composed, bone-deep steady. I used to shrink when you talk like that, she said. Not anymore. Marcus laughed, brittle and rattled. You think you've won anything? Everything you have, everything she has, comes from that filthy woman Jeremiah. Nita cut in, voice quiet but sharper than any blade. My mother loved him. You hated that, and you hated me for proving she mattered. Grace moved beside her, taking Nita's hand, not timidly, but like a vow. For the first time in 60 years, the two daughters of the same Apache woman stood shoulder to shoulder, unbroken, unashamed. Marcus saw it and snapped. This is all her fault, he howled, stabbing his finger toward Nita. She was a mistake, a stain. If she had just disappeared like she was supposed to, none of... Sheriff Morrison slammed the warrant down on the desk like a judge's gavel. That's enough. Marcus tried to back away, but the deputy blocked the door. His swagger had collapsed into frantic, cornered panic. You can't arrest me, Marcus sputtered. I'm a Vance. Morrison's voice was low, steady, unshakable. Not anymore. He nodded to the prosecutor, who read the charges aloud, each one heavier than the last. Fraud, destruction of legal documents, identity concealment, kidnapping, and attempted human trafficking. Marcus reeled. Trafficking? That's absurd. The prosecutor didn't blink. Selling a woman's genetic information for private medical profit falls under the same statute. He folded the papers neatly. You shouldn't have said the quiet part out loud. Morrison stepped forward, cuffs in hand. Marcus tried one last time, voice cracking. This half-blood set me up. She's not even... Nita's gaze cut him off. Calm, steady, stronger than she'd ever felt. I'm exactly who I'm meant to be, she said, and you just proved who you really are. Marcus froze. Rage, fear, humiliation all warring across his face. Sheriff Morrison closed the cuffs around his wrist with a decisive snap. Marcus Vance, he said, voice echoing off the walls like thunder across dry plains. You're under arrest for fraud, destruction of evidence, kidnapping, and conspiracy to traffic a human being. Outside, the cold wind screamed down the street, like the ridge itself exhaling after decades of buried truth. Inside, Nita and Grace didn't speak. They didn't have to. For the first time, justice had finally turned to face the right direction. Snow thinned across the valley as winter began to loosen its grip. The air still held an icy bite, but the sun returned in thin, warm-lit ribbons, melting the drifts around Devil's Ridge. For the first time in months, the land felt as though it was exhaling, slow, steady, relieved. News of Marcus Vance's arrest spread across 3 counties like wildfire. The courtroom in Trinidad filled wall to wall during his hearings. Townsfolk, ranchers, old acquaintances, and a few who had benefited from his fear-mongering. It didn't matter anymore. His lies had been recorded, his crimes documented, his arrogance displayed before the law. When the judge read out the charges, fraud, destruction of evidence, kidnapping, conspiracy to traffic a human being, the last of Marcus's swagger bled out of him. He left the courthouse in shackles, escorted by deputies, his future shrinking into the iron-barred world he had earned with his own hands. Grace and Nita stood together on the courthouse steps as the crowd dispersed. There was no triumph in their faces, just quiet, wind-worn relief. Justice in the West rarely arrived clean, but this time it had come with clarity. A week later, the notarized order arrived in the mail. Jeremiah Vance's real will was legally reinstated. The land around Devil's Ridge, including the cabin, the creek, and the lower pastures, belonged to the two daughters of the Apache woman he had loved. Not Marcus, not the Vance estate, not the men who had tried to erase their mother's name. For the first time in 60 years, the truth carried weight. Returning to Devil's Ridge, the cabin sat quiet and weather-scarred when the sisters returned, as if waiting to see who would cross its threshold next. Nita paused at the doorway, her hand brushing the worn wooden frame her mother once touched. For a heartbeat, she felt a small ache, old sorrow meeting new hope. Inside, the place was dusty and cold, but alive beneath the grime. Grace rolled up her sleeves. "Let's make it ours." And so they did. They scrubbed the walls until the pine scent returned, sharp and clean. They hung woven Apache blankets over the windows, their sun-bleached reds and midnight blues warming the room. They repaired the stone hearth, stacking firewood that crackled into a steady, comforting blaze. On the mantel, they placed the few belongings their mother had left behind: her beaded earrings, a carved wooden comb, and the small clay pot she used for herbs. Every piece felt like a stitch pulling them closer together. Nita moved slowly through the space, running her fingers over every object as though memorizing textures: pine, wool, clay, smoke. This was the life her mother was denied. This was the home she had tried to build alone. Now it was being rebuilt, with two daughters instead of one. Outside, the sun dipped behind Devil's Ridge, casting the cabin in gold. Nita stepped out onto the porch, the cold brushing her cheeks but not sinking quite as deep as before. "This place," she whispered. "It finally feels like it's mine." Grace came to stand beside her. "It's ours, both of us." For the first time, Nita didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She wasn't the forgotten bloodline. She wasn't the half-breed mistake Marcus tried to define her as. She was a woman with a name, a home, a family, standing on land that carried her mother's voice in the wind. Despite the peace settling around the ridge, one truth still shadowed Nita: the Huntington's diagnosis that might one day claim her mind and body. But she had choices now, real choices, not Marcus's manipulations. The medical corporation reached out again, this time with respect instead of hunger. Nita allowed them limited access, her terms, her schedule, her body under her own authority. For the first time, she felt power in a place where fear once lived. Some nights, Nita sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, feeling the tremor that came and went in her fingers. But instead of dread, she felt something steadier, a bone-deep acceptance, a willingness to fight, to live, to build, because now she wasn't alone. On the third day of cleaning, Grace climbed into the loft to clear out old crates. Dust rose in soft clouds as she pried open a cedar chest lined with moth-eaten blankets. "Nita," she called, voice trembling in a way that instantly caught her sister's attention. Nita climbed the ladder. Grace held a small envelope, weathered, edges frayed, sealed with wax long since cracked. Across the front, in looping, careful handwriting, were the words neither of them expected. "For my two daughters." Nita's breath caught, her chest tightening with something sharp and tender all at once. Grace whispered, voice breaking. "She knew, she always knew." The cabin fell utterly silent, except for the fire softly popping below, and the wind sliding against the roof like a mother's touch. Nita and Grace sat together, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of a mother's final truth, staring at the unopened letter addressed to both of them. Night settled over Devil's Ridge in a slow, tender hush. The world outside the cabin lay wrapped in wind and moonlight, the kind of night that made a person believe the spirits of the land moved softly through the pines. Inside, the fire burned in steady, warm-lit waves, painting the walls with gold. Nita and Grace sat side by side at the old wooden table. The envelope lay between them, thin, weathered, fragile as a bird's wing. Neither moved at first. Then Nita slid her thumb beneath the broken seal. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, the writing delicate, looping, touched with the softness of a woman who had lived between two worlds, one that shunned her and one she never stopped loving. Nita unfolded the letter. Her breath wavered. Grace squeezed her arm once silently. And then Nita read, "The Tsuneronasum, my daughters, I am sorry." The words hit like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through years of buried hurt. I could not keep our family together. I tried. But the world can be cruel to women like us, and crueler still to the children born of two different bloods. They took one of you from my arms before I could breathe your name, and they tried to make the other believe she was less than she is. Grace's breath trembled. Nita felt her chest tighten until it hurt. The letter continued, steady and heartbreakingly gentle. But listen to me, my girls. Apache blood is not a burden. It is strength. It is wind and stone, storm and sun. It runs deep, and it will carry you farther than any man's name. Nita pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth. Her shoulders shook once. Quiet, raw-hearted, unstoppable. Grace wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. It was an embrace made of all the years they never had. All the nights their mother cried alone. All the mornings Nita woke feeling unwanted. All the days Grace walked the world not knowing why she felt incomplete. Nita leaned into her sister, letting the tears come. Years' worth, a lifetime's worth. She hadn't cried since she was a girl. Tonight she let herself. Grace held her tighter. One day you will find each other. One day the truth will rise from the ground like spring grass. When that day comes, come home to this cabin. This place is your light. This place is where my love waits. The paper trembled in Nita's hands, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was steadier than she expected. She knew, Nita whispered. She always knew we'd end up here. Grace nodded, wiping her eyes. She left us a map. We just didn't know how to read it. They sat there for a long time, the fire crackling softly, the cabin finally feeling whole, like three hearts existed inside it rather than two. Later, they talked about the future. Not the shattered, haunted version Marcus had planned for them, but a real one, a hopeful one. They would create a fund in their mother's name, the Eha Vance Foundation, a place where people with Huntington's could find treatment, dignity, and a voice. A legacy built from compassion, not greed. Their mother would have wanted that. Just before dawn, Nita stepped onto the porch. The valley stretched below her, wide, wind-beaten, rugged, alive. Snow shimmered under the early light, and somewhere far off, a lone coyote called. Nita breathed in the cold mountain air, letting it fill her in a way that felt almost sacred. She closed her eyes, whispered into the wind, "Mother, I'm home." Behind her, Grace stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the fire's glow. Two sisters who had spent their lives searching for belonging, now bound by truth, by land, by blood. Together they stepped down from the porch, into a world that finally felt like theirs. Not victims of the past, but women strong enough to rewrite the future. At the end,